Hello, my name is Daniel Perez and today I will present Liquidations DeFi on a knife edge. This is a joint work with Sam Werner and Benjamin Livshits from Imperial College London and Jiahua from University College London. For those who want the slides, they're available at the following URL. So in today's talk I will first give the background, then describe our model and methodology, finally go through our analysis, present the results, and then present a few takeaways. So first, for the background, very basic level, I will start by smart contracts, so which are programs deployed on chain. When we focus on Ethereum smart contracts, they are written usually in Solidity. They're compiled with some bytecode, which is then sent through transactions to Ethereum. And when users want to interact with the smart contract, they need to send transactions to the contract, which can then perform some actions, communicate with other contracts, and so on. And there are a few building blocks which are needed for what we'll explore later in this talk. The first one, which is oracles. So oracles are typically there to facilitate on-chain access to some external information. One of the most common type of oracle are price oracles, which will contain the information about prices, such as, for example, the price of the dollars compared to some other currency, or the price of Ethereum, and so on. And these are smart contracts that are typically updated on a regular basis. And very often they require some level of trust. There's a lot of work to try to decrease the level of trust required, but it's a bit out of scope of this presentation, so I will skip over this. And another important point, or building block, are stablecoins, which are some crypto assets of which the price is pegged to some other currency, very often the dollar, but it could be anything like euro, gold, or any other sort of asset. And these have very different type of implementation. I will not go into details about this, but there are what's called custodial against non-custodial sort of implementation. And depending on how these are implemented, it can result in some fairly large movements above or below their target. So for example, a coin that is supposed to be pegged with the dollars could go way above or way below, where above or below can be somewhere around 5, even 10, and sometimes worst cases 30% out of the range of the price. So this will be important for some of the issues we will see later in this talk. And now, so the main analysis that we do in this paper is about protocols for loanable funds, which we call PLF. These are also sometimes called lending protocols. And they are basically protocols that intermediate funds between users. So it allows user to be able to borrow money, but unlike peer-to-peer lending, in PLFs the funds are pooled, which means that some users will supply money into a pool and other users will be allowed to borrow from this pool. And another particularity is that to be able to borrow, because of the trustless nature of blockchain, users have to deposit some collateral upfront to make sure that these users will not run away with the money they borrowed. So these PLFs are built themselves on a couple of building blocks. So a very basic one is the interest rate model. So basically how do users pay interest for the money they borrow, and how suppliers get back interest for the money they are lending to the protocol. Another important point, which we very briefly discussed, is collateralization. And this is so an amount of money that the user will have to deposit in order to be able to borrow assets. And this should always be more than the amount he's borrowing. And if a user were to default, so to not have enough collateral to cover his borrow, some other user would be able to liquidate his position, where liquidate means repaying the borrow of the user and getting the collateral of this user, and it results usually in discounts. So liquidators are incentivized because they will get typically a 10% reduction when getting the collateral of the user. And finally, another important point is a governance mechanism, which is typically what is used to decide on kind of the fate of the protocol, how it will evolve, and this governance is usually done through governance tokens. And something important is that in many of these protocols, governance tokens are distributed to actively participating users to incentivize them and in some sense thank them for their participation in the protocol. And these governance tokens are also normal tokens, which means that they can be sold and bought in other markets directly too. So now there's quite a common questions around this PLF is if I have to supply money to borrow it, why would I even use this in the first place? Which is a fair question, and there are actually a couple of use cases for this. Well, first and the most simplistic one I would say is simply acting as a supplier and putting the money in the protocol to earn money on the interest of the supplied funds. Then another one, which is also common in traditional markets, is to take short positions. So if a user thinks that an asset will depreciate in value, he can supply funds in the protocol, borrow the asset he thinks will devaluate, sell all the assets he just borrowed, and later in time, after the asset loses value, he can buy it again at a lower price, repay his debt, and make some profits in the process. Then another use case is to take a leveraged long position, so to basically increase exposure to some assets that the user thinks will increase in value this time. And this process is slightly more complicated, but we will discuss this in details later in this presentation. And finally, the last use case, which is a bit arguable whether this is a use case or not, but a lot of users are actually supplying and borrowing funds simply to be able to receive the governance token as rewards, because this governance token has some value on regular markets and can be sold for actual for any other asset. And basically, as long as it is profitable for the user to supply funds and borrow funds and then sell off the earned token, they will be incentivized to do so. So now I will start talking about our model and the methodology we used in this paper. So I'll go very briefly through a couple of terms that we use in the rest of the presentation. So first there is the concept of market. So typically a PLF is composed of many different markets where a single market is attached to a particular crypto asset. So for example, it could be DAI or it could be ETH or any other asset. And each user can supply funds and borrow funds from a market. And something important is that a user can supply funds in a market and borrow funds from another market. So for example, I could supply DAI, which is the DAI market, and then borrow funds in the ETH market. And so the supply is the money that is deposited in the market, and the borrow is the funds that are loaned out of the market. And there is then the collateral, which is the funds that are available for a user to actually back a borrow position. So the main difference between the collateral and the supply is that only part of the supply can be used as collateral. We will discuss this briefly later. And finally, there's lock funds, which is the difference between the supplied and the borrowed funds. So for example, if I supply 100 USD and I borrow the equivalent of 75, the locked fund will end up being 25. Then there are a couple of different actors in the systems. So there is a supplier, a user who will deposit some funds into the market, the borrower who will borrow the funds, and because to borrow one must have collateral, so supply funds, a borrower will always be a supplier. And finally, there are liquidators who are other actors or the same, it can be either, who will wait for users to default on their borrow and buy their collateral at a discount. And an important thing to take into account here is the conditions in which a user can be liquidated. And there is an important variable here, which is a collateral factor, also called a loan-to-value ratio in other protocols. And this is the ratio between the supply and the collateral funds. So for example, if a collateral factor is 0.75 and I supply 100 USD worth of asset, I will be able to borrow up to 75 USD worth of asset, which means that my position always should be over collateralized by this collateral factor. And another point to take into account is that because there are many markets in many different currencies, usually when the protocol will try to compute how collateralized is a position, it will try to convert everything to some currencies that could be USD or ETH or anything else, but these two are the most common ones. And it will aggregate over all the markets. And a user is liquidable if the sum of all his borrows exceeds the sum of all his collaterals across all markets. And so, for example, if I provide the equivalent of 100 USD in a market and I borrow 75 USD and the collateral factor is 0.75, I will have the exact minimum collateral provided, and if there were to be a price movement which would make my supplied amount slightly less, then I would fall below this threshold and become liquidable. So now with this in mind, there is also what I discussed briefly before, which is how to use all this to take leverage positions, and in particular how to increase exposure to an asset. So the process is fairly simple, although a bit dangerous too. And for example, if I want to increase my exposure to ETH, what I can do is first I will supply ETH on a PLF. Using this ETH, I will borrow some DAI or whatever other assets actually. Then I will use this DAI to purchase some new ETH, so sell DAI for ETH, and then I can resupply the ETH. And of course this can be done in a loop, where the amount that I can borrow every time will decrease by the collateral factor, but it can increase my exposure to, for example, here ETH by a considerable amount. And obviously with this sort of position, because the exposure is increased, if there were to be a big price drop in ETH, then I would lose much more than with a normal position. So with all this in mind, we decided to analyze Compound, which is one of the largest PLFs around. And we analyzed their smart contracts, in particular different events emitted by their smart contracts. So we looked at their borrow, their repays, and how they mint, redeem, and also at the liquidations, and we'll discuss all of the results in the next section. So now in terms of analysis, we looked at several things. And the first thing we looked at is the actual borrowers and suppliers over time. And so here in both graphs, so on the left we have the number of borrowers and suppliers and borrowers over time. On the right we have the amount of funds supplied and borrowed, as well as the amount locked. And we can see that in both graphs there is a sharp increase around mid-June last year. And this corresponds to when the comp rewards start to be distributed, where comp is the governance token of Compound. And so this created obviously a new incentive for people to borrow and supply funds on Compound. And we can see that there is a really sharp increase, especially in total supply, where it goes from somewhere around 200 millions to almost 2 billions at some point, before going down a bit after that. And the amount borrowed and the total locked also increased considerably. And then we were interested into looking at who was actually using this, how many users were actually really contributing to this supply and this borrow. And we found that, at least at the time of analysis, the users tended to be even more concentrated than typically, Also, this kind of sort of exponential distribution in the user is quite common for this sort of protocols and in most markets in general, I would say. But here is quite extreme, and we can see that, for example, the top user accounts for almost 28% of the supplied funds and for more than 37% of the total borrows. And the top 10 users account for almost half of the total supply and almost 60% of the total borrows. So this is really very concentrated, and there seems to be a very small number of users who contribute the most to supplying and borrowing and compound. And then we decided to look also a bit at the leveraging spirals and to see how this influence the actual amount locked versus total supply and borrow. And we first looked at the top account to see how much he actually locked in the protocol and how much he was sort of recycling this spiral. And in total, he seems to have provided around 55 million USD worth of money in the protocol, and then use this sort of spiral to end up with a supply of 342 millions and a total borrows of 247 millions. And after checking, this user seems to be there mostly to try to get some comp rewards rather than taking any sort of leverage position on some other asset. And then we look at the market and the protocol as a whole, and we found that roughly 2,000 accounts were using this sort of leverage spiral. So this is approximately 40% of the total number of borrowers. And we also found that pretty much half of the total supply is generated using these leveraging spirals, which amounts to approximately 600 millions at the time of analysis, which was around September last year. And then we went on and looked at the liquidation risk. And so basically how much risk were the user taking in terms of how close they were to becoming liquidable. And we found out that the user behavior has changed dramatically with the launch of Compound, and users tended to be fairly conservative before that. So almost all users were at least 25% above the minimum collateral that they should have had, which also makes sense because at that point most users were using the protocol to take some sort of opinionated position on an asset, and so we're probably more aware of this sort of price fluctuations that could get them liquidated. While after the comp launch, there were more than 40% of the users that were within 5% of being liquidated, which means that depending on what asset they were borrowing and supplying, some very small price change could have gotten them liquidated. So overall, we found that the level of risk taken by the users increased a lot, and we wanted to see basically how close they would be to liquidations if there were to be some price changes, and how many of them would actually get liquidated. So we looked at DAI in particular because it is a stable coin, but it is also not that stable in the sense that there are like quite often some fluctuation of a couple of % on the price of DAI. And we tried to see how to do a sensitivity analysis and see how much collateral would be liquidated with a decrease of 3 and 5% in the price of DAI. And so this is a plot here, and we can see that it would have been very little before the launch of the comp token, or rather the distribution of the comp token, and that it increased a lot, and there were way more users who would have been liquidated should the price have fluctuated just a bit, with 3% decrease in the price could have been resulted in almost 20 million USD worth of collateral liquidated. And actually, so this analysis was done around September, but in November last year this actually happened, and there was some sharp movement in the price of DAI, and this resulted in even much worse than what we predicted. There were approximately $88 million apparently that got liquidated during this period. And so finally, we also analyzed and looked at the liquidations over time, and also at the liquidators and how they react, how fast they are, and so on. And so we can see that there are like usually some very sharp periods where there are liquidations, and this corresponds in sharp movements in the market. So for example, around March, this was when there were a crash in the markets due to COVID and so on. And then in July and in August, there were two events where the price of DAI again fluctuated quite a bit, and this resulted in spikes in liquidations. And then we also had a look at the liquidators, and we found out that they are now extremely efficient. So almost more than half, almost like 70% of the total liquidations happen within the same block as they become liquidable. So basically the users have absolutely no time to react. And we also saw that Liquidator has become more and more efficient over time. And now I think this number is even higher than it used to be. So finally, a few takeaways here. So we saw that the governance token has changed PLF users' behavior significantly. It attracted a lot of liquidity, but also many users started taking more and more risk. We also saw that the users tend to underestimate the volatility of stablecoin and to take too risky position, which results in the fact that very small price deviations can lead to very large liquidation. And this was indeed the cause of a very large liquidation last November. And finally, we saw that liquidators became much more efficient. So now if there is any liquidation opportunity, chances are that a liquidator will grab this opportunity within the block where the position becomes liquidable. So this is it. And for more information, please feel free to have a look at the papers. Thank you very much for listening.